Nice, nice. So, Mike, like before we start, like, can you introduce yourself for the audience?
Sure. My name's Mike Camporini. I'm a PT and a strength coach. I'm based out of Boston, Massachusetts. I've had a lot of different experiences in terms of, I guess if we're talking more about athletics, I predominantly work with baseball players. I work with some basketball players, golfers, but you kind of name it. I've had my share of experiences in any sport, whether it's, you know, football, soccer, hockey, figure skating, like you name it. So anyway, was that my education, I guess. I did my exercise science undergrad at Springfield College, and then I did my got my doctorate in PT at Simmons. That's a small school in Boston as well. And then that's pretty much it with me in a nutshell. So there you go.
Nice, nice. So, uh, before I start asking like question related to like training, what sport do you enjoy working with the most?
I don't know, I guess right now I should say baseball because that's the majority of my time and my commitment right now, but I don't have a, a solid preference. It's kind of interesting to feel like there's different personalities that are either attracted and molded by different sports. So it's interesting to kind of meet all the different personalities and people and everyone in the different sports. I think that's like a classic conversation that a lot of like college strength coaches have is they kind of like compare and contrast all the different athletes to every different sport that you guys are working with. So it's always interesting to get like a college S&C's take on that. But yeah, I guess that's my very vague answer for you.
Nice, nice. So, I'm gonna start by asking like, cause I know you share like multiple like posts on Instagram about like pitching mechanics. So,
Mhm.
how about like can you start by like I know this is probably hard by just explaining it without any visual, but like uh can you kind of explain that like the overall like pitching mechanics?
In just like pitching mechanics in general or
Yeah,
what?
like cause uh start probably let's start by like how like yeah, just overall general like the pitching mechanics.
Okay. Um, well, I guess from like a very general sense with pitching, the majority of what guys are trying to do is essentially transfer as much energy as possible into the baseball to make it go as fast as possible, go in the direction they want it to go, and then make it move in trickier and trickier ways to for the hitter to hit it. So where that energy gets generated and how that energy gets generated is kind of where I come in, where I essentially need to take a look at their mechanics and take a look at their throwing to see are there advantageous ways that they're creating that energy or are there non-advantageous ways to creating that energy. Specifically how mechanics break down is really like dependent from person to person, but in general, they're essentially trying to just transfer energy from their backside leg to their front side leg to their throwing arm and everywhere in between. So how they do that and then how the energy gets transferred between all the limbs is kind of the bread and butter of what I'm trying to accomplish for a lot of these guys. So
Nice. So, I you also shared a post about like how can we like use wave to improve our understanding of like pitching? Can you also like touch a little, like kind of explain like like how about this? Like how like why do you want to start by using like wave to help people understand like the pitching mechanics?
sure. In that particular post, it was a little we can take this in a couple different directions. I think I'll take it in one particular direction as opposed to the post that I think you're alluding to. So we were just talking about mechanics and how guys are essentially transferring energy from different parts of their body to other parts of their body, right? So let's kind of take a step back to appreciate energy and what energy is, right? So energy is just force being applied over a specific distance. So that's for our consideration, the distance would be like someone's back foot up into their back hip if they're throwing. So that's a specific distance, and energy is or force is traveling across that distance. Energy always takes the form of a wave. So we think of waves as like on a beach or in the ocean or something like that, and that's just kinetic energy moving through a medium. So that medium would be water. In our case for the human body, it's also water, but there's different mediums as well in terms of you're moving through muscle, you're moving through ligament, you're moving through bone, you're moving through blood, you're moving through any anatomical structure that you can really think of through that area, right? But it's still energy, and so it's still a waveform that's moving through your body. Okay. So in order to better understand that, if you're essentially just looking at your waveform and how it could potentially move through that body, it makes my job a little bit easier to visually understand it and manipulate it potentially based on their biomechanics or how I would want to manipulate their pitching and things like that. So is that
So, yeah,
is that kind of along the lines of what you were thinking of, or
yeah. So,
okay.
um, if we're gonna like dive a little bit deeper into this, so when you say like when pitching, there's you need to push back with your back leg and maybe
Mhm.
land and push forward with your back leg and push back with your front leg. Right? Am I correct? Yep.
Yeah, essentially. Yep.
So if we're using wave to explain it, or like how would you kind of like break it down?
Sure. So a lot of times if you look at something like a force plate when someone's throwing, we're essentially looking at like the direction of those forces, right? So if I'm a righty pitcher and I'm standing on my right leg and I'm going to push towards home plate, I'm applying a certain force into the ground. And so you have a ground reaction force that gets applied into my back leg. So that's a reactionary force that would be traveling through my body. Okay. So as we were just alluding to, you have that ground reaction force that's moving through my body. So that would be the medium. And then how that force is moving through my body would essentially be the waveform. So that's the energy. And so I have a wave of energy from that ground reaction force coming from my back foot up into my body that is then projecting my body towards home plate. If I don't do anything with my front foot, I would essentially fall flat on my face, and that would be the end of the pitch, right? So I got to stick my front foot out in front of me to essentially decelerate that energy, but then it applies another ground reaction force up through that leg, which then sends another wave of energy through the rest of your body that gets hopefully channeled as much as you can into the rest of your body, into the throwing hand, which then gets projected into the baseball. So you have a wave of energy coming from the back leg, a wave of energy coming up through the front leg that then gets channeled as best you can into the baseball itself. And then hopefully the baseball goes where the pitcher wants it to go and you get a successful outcome. So
So, can you give us like maybe some example about like when you watch someone pitch, how does this like the how does this help you like figure out like what does this athlete need?
Sure. So, and you had even asked a question previously before we were talking about like ISAs and helical angles and things like that. So let's start there because then that'll serve as a little bit more background into what your question is kind of alluding to. Okay. So there's a lot of things that we can kind of glean from an ISA or a helical angle. In this conversation, predominantly what we'd be able to look at is the overall shape of the individual we're looking at. Okay. And I tend to think a lot about like the shape of the structure as opposed to like other characteristics you could say for a few reasons, right? Let's we'll back up a little bit. So the ISA is essentially a representation of the body's entire helical structure. We just pick on the ISA because it's like very obvious and apparent in terms of being able to identify like, oh, okay, that's what it looks like. But that's essentially just one rib level because you can go another level above it and see a very similar angle, and then another level above it and see a similar angle, and another level above it and see a similar angle. Same as you go down below, it might not be osseous structures like a rib, but then if you look at the shape of the obliques, it'll have a similar angle, and et cetera, as you go essentially all the way down into the pelvis and then into the limbs as well. So it's fairly well established that the human body has this helical organization from this macro level of looking at the bones and all of the muscles, and also at the micro level in terms of just looking at like the myofibrils and even like a sarcomere or something like that. There's a lot of reasons for that in terms of why that helical structure is present, right? But if we're talking about how energy is moving through a body, that structure, that shape is essentially what dictates how that energy has the potential capability to move through the body. So someone who's more of like your wide ISA archetype is going to have a much different shape and waveform and structure for how energy is going to move through them as opposed to someone who's more narrow. You could follow this analogy with like, if you look at something like a river. So how water is moving through the two ends of the riverbank is going to be very different based on the width of that river, how that river kind of meanders. So then the energy or essentially the water and how it's moving through the riverbanks is going to be different. Sometimes it'll move a lot faster, sometimes it'll move a lot slower, sometimes it'll accelerate around a specific curve in one end, sometimes it'll decelerate around a specific curve or another end. But overall, that shape of that structure is what is dictating the dynamics of how things are essentially moving through it. So that's where shape becomes very, very important for when you're trying to essentially analyze how energy is moving through that structure as well. And so you take your pictures and you kind of get a sense of like, okay, here's your overall structure and here's your overall shape. This is like the width of your riverbanks. If we're looking at specific joint angles or something like that, maybe a rib cage is coming out in this direction, maybe a pelvis is coming out in that direction. That kind of tells me how things are going to potentially meander through a certain area. And is that good for our objective? Is that bad for our objective? Is that useful for their particular shape and how they want to throw? Is that disadvantageous to their potential shape and how they want to throw? That's kind of like the golden question that we gotta tinker around with and see if can we change certain things? Is it useful for if we do change certain things? Things like that. So is
Cool,
that
cool. That's
okay?
cool. Because I know like um people talk about ISA angle, they tend to say like narrow ISA versus wide ISA angle and uh they say like probably narrow, correct me if I'm wrong, probably narrow ISA is more elastic and wide eyes is more forceful or like more like strength dominant. And
Um,
yep.
keep going. Finish your question. I'll jump in.
And I always wonder that like is like why is that the case and can we like can it change that or is it like a like genetic or like it's born that way?
I think we have to be very specific about how we're describing some of these things. Because for a wide ISA, to kind of arbitrarily just put them in like this forceful category, and then vice versa for a narrow ISA and putting them in like this elastic category, kind of muddies the water in terms of how we're looking at both those two terms and those two people. So for someone like a wide ISA individual, they still, excuse me, they still definitely are demonstrating and have the capability to demonstrate a stretch shortening cycle. A stretch shortening cycle essentially has to be created with any kind of athletic event that you're taking part in. How they go about creating that stretch shortening cycle and the nature of that stretch shortening cycle can potentially be very different between a wide ISA and a narrow ISA individual. If we're talking about them very generally as just these categories rather than two different people, right? Because this can go right out the water as soon as you're looking at two different actual people, right? But we're speaking generalities right now. So with a wide ISA, typically what you're going to find with these individuals is that I call them like higher pressure systems, so that it's easier for them to generate a ton of pressure really, really quickly. And so therefore they can generate a ton of stiffness really, really quickly. And I think this is where the the notion of calling them like high force production individuals, alongside the fact that, it's easier for them to hit higher numbers on a deadlift, or it's easier for them to hit higher numbers on a squat just because they can create a lot of that pressure and that stiffness comparatively to a narrow ISA. But that doesn't mean that that's all just like um, this muscular strategy that they're demonstrating. Instead, when they do generate that stiffness and that pressure, it's a lot easier. Well, there's two things that really have to happen. If you're generating a lot of pressure and stiffness, that likely also means that your connective tissue is going to be a lot stiffer and harder for you to deform. So you need to generate a lot of that pressure and stiffness in order to deform that that connective tissue in general. Because of that, so if I have a stiffer rubber band, it's harder for me to deform. So I need to create more force in order to deform it. And then alongside that, it's not going to absorb or deform as much. And so it's not going to be able to absorb as much of that energy. And so it's going to be demonstrated in terms of showing that overall stretch shortening cycle in a lot faster of a behavior. So you're not going to get like this long, graceful stretch and then this long production of that elastic energy. It's going to be very quick, very sharp, very high pressure, high force, things like that. Um, but it's still their strategy that they need to do to deform that connective tissue. Now, for a narrow ISA, it's a lot different. These individuals typically tend to have not as stiff connective tissue and strategies that don't lend themselves to being able to generate a lot of pressure. So they kind of go hand in hand. So if they don't need to generate a lot as much pressure and they don't need to deform their connective tissue as much, they don't need as much of that force to deform everything. And then it's easier for that connective tissue to deform. So then they're getting like this longer, more elegant stretch shortening cycle and absorption of the tissue. And then they can, takes a longer time to essentially push all of that energy out. So they have a different stretch shortening cycle time. signature compared to your wide ISA individual. Does that help clarify some of the things that we're kind of
Yeah,
talking about
yeah,
here?
yeah.
Cool. Yeah, it it shouldn't really be considered like I hate the like this category of like a force production athlete versus a like an elastic athlete. Like both of them are elastic. You're just looking at different time signatures of how they're trying to generate that elasticity. And that's based on essentially their shape, right? Because the shape is also dictating how much pressure they can generate. That's dictated by the density of their overall connective tissue and how stiff everything is. And then this kind of even goes into like helical angles and waveforms as well. Like if I have a wider ISA, I'm not going to have a waveform that's as long, which also behooves me because I don't have the time to generate that waveform that's as long because I have stiffer, denser connective tissue. So I got to do it in a shorter time frame. So everything kind of like elegantly lines up in terms of their structure, their shape, how energy would move through them, how energy is absorbed in their connective tissue, and then how their shape is also enabling them to produce the force that's deforming the connective tissue. So everything kind of helps to, feed into itself for their structure and how they express motion. So yeah.
Cool. So, uh, so if we're talking, like, let me ask you this. So for like, um, in your experience, if you're talking about like maybe pitcher,
Mhm.
so different like structure, like different, does different accent angle like change how your approach to like train the athlete? And like, can you give us an example? Like, how would that like change things?
Sure. I think the biggest thing that would change would be my expectation for them. So with coaches, we're in like this really weird circumstance where we kind of need to be able to see the potential in someone that we're working with. And it's almost like we got to like see into the future, which is impossible, but we're just making, estimated guesses in terms of what this person is capable of from like a performance standpoint. And then we need to try and construct certain programs to enable them to achieve that potential that we see in them, right? An individual structure and how they're able to kind of go about the strategies that we were just talking about changes the kind of potential that I would see in order for them to most successfully express their peak athletic performance. So let's take like a very prototypical wide ISA pitcher. So these would be guys like are you a big baseball fan or not too much?
Yeah, I'm a big baseball fan.
All right, so let's take like a guy like Roger Clemens is like a perfect like prototypical wide ISA kind of individual. So he's bigger, stockier, has a much more like aggressive, quote unquote, forceful way of going about things, but he needs to demonstrate a lot of that higher level force production, again, to deform some of his stiffer connective tissue, right? Your wide ISA individuals are also going to have a different sort of expression of their layback. So layback is essentially like this moment where you're getting like the peak amount of force production and energy production within the throwing phase. And we can kind of map it from front foot strike to when they get to the most amount of external rotation until ball release. It's kind of that like peak athletic window for any sort of throwing athlete, right? So for your wide ISA individual, I expect the window of time for them to demonstrate that entire phase to be shorter, but also more forceful because of the reasons that I alluded to before. So they have stiffer connective tissue. So they need to generate a lot more force to deform that connective tissue as much as possible. So really the connective tissue we're talking about is in their throwing arm. So if I have stiffer tissue, I'm not expecting them to be able to pull it back as much, maintain that length and that deformation for as long before everything snaps forward. So that's that shorter time window that I was alluding to in terms of the deformation of their and the demonstration of their peak output, right? Versus someone like Randy Johnson, where that deformation and those mechanics are a lot different. So where they're getting that deformation of the tissue, the number of segments that that deformation is extended across, how they're demonstrating that layback, how much external rotation they're staying in while they're going through that time period is going to be a lot different with Roger Clemens compared to Randy Johnson, right? So now, obviously, not everyone is going to throw like Roger Clemens, and not everyone is going to throw like Randy Johnson. There's going to be different intricacies in how we can kind of get them to demonstrate peak stretch shortening cycle and peak deformation and the peak behavior of that for person to person. But I guess those would be like your two genuine prototypes that you would kind of look at in terms of the differences for that, right? And then we get into like, different movement presentations and different overall strategies at different parts of the body. So, if I have someone who like on their backside leg is demonstrating too much external rotation, that means that too much energy is going to be going away from midline. So if they're trying to push with their back foot and I need to get energy to travel up and propagate towards their midline, maybe I need to change the overall distribution of internal rotation throughout their whole leg so that they can generate more force and more energy in the desired direction that I'm trying to get it to go. And then that's what we kind of look at when we're like breaking things down frame by frame in terms of like, okay, at this moment in their mechanics, we see some of the energies actually going in this direction, but we want to go in this direction. I, as a physical therapist, can come in and kind of tweak things from a biomechanics perspective to make that structure go in that particular direction. And then from an S&C standpoint, we can kind of train the biomechanics of, okay, now that I can go in that direction, we can now select exercises to train that energy, at least going in that direction. And then now at a different rate that we can get that energy to go in that direction because now we're loading different tissue structures and things like that at that point. So that's kind of all a lot of examples and how that would like kind of boil down. So
I like it. I like it. I like it. So
cool.
bear with me right now, because I'm gonna ask another like probably a very vague question, but like I'm gonna
Fine.
ask it anyway. So when it comes to like ISA angle, like wide versus narrow, I know some coaches gonna say like I know a lot of them use like traditional deadlift as an example. Like, should
Mhm.
someone do heavy deadlift or not, or spend a lot of time with heavy deadlift? Like, I want to ask what your take on this,
Sure. Just from like an ISA standpoint
yeah,
or just like a programming standpoint
just
or
from a ISA standpoint.
well, here's what I'll tell you about this is that deciding or making a decision just based off of one variable, the likelihood that that's even a good position to be in and only basing your decision off of that one reason probably isn't going to be a very good situation. So when I'm trying to choose exercises for individuals and we're going through exercise selection, do I take their ISA into account? Sure. But I take it into account within the context of what it is that I'm trying to achieve for that person. So there's other adaptations that I'm also going to care about for their particular goals or their particular athletic performance that feeds into the decision. I'm never going to just look at a guy and say like, oh, he's super narrow. I'm never going to want to load him up with heavy weight. I'll still want to load him up with heavy weight, potentially, depending on the different circumstances. So, if we take a look at his overall force production capabilities, and he's way on the low end in terms of being able to produce like max effort force at lower speeds, okay, it probably behooves us to do some sort of variation that's going to enable him to demonstrate high force production at lower speeds. What we choose in terms of an exercise selection to create that for him is going to be different. Maybe it's not going to be like a 500-pound trap bar deadlift. Maybe it's not going to be a sumo deadlift. Maybe it's not going to be a back squat. Maybe it makes more sense for him to do like a rack pull overcoming isometric type uh, quote unquote deadlift position. Do you still want to put that in the deadlift category? I don't know. That's up to you. But the nature of that exercise is creating specific adaptations, and that potential exercise might also be more beneficial just from a biomechanics standpoint for them to demonstrate those adaptations that we're trying to create. So if I want maximum force production, maximum motor unit recruitment, and increasing the maximum stiffness within their connective tissue, something that maybe a narrow ISA individual would need, depending on their phase of training, are there better positions to put them in for them to demonstrate that overall output? If I put them in like a bottom of a squat and have them do their overcoming isometric, it's probably a way less beneficial position than if I try to put them in like a high quarter squat position to be able to demonstrate their stiffness. Or maybe, we're talking about someone else where there is a very specific biomechanical position that I want them to demonstrate that stiffness in. So let's say you have a narrow ISA pitcher that really gets deep into his front side where he gets like a lot of knee bend. The knee really comes forward and he really like translates forward when he's throwing. And we're concluding that, okay, the reduced amount of internal rotation through his front side and the reduced amount of maximum force production is also reducing the amount of connective tissue stiffness that he can demonstrate. And that's what's enabling him to move forward more in his front side, but energy isn't going up through his body to the ball. Instead, it's continuing to home plate. We don't want that. Okay. What if we take him, put him in a above parallel Jefferson split squat, overcoming action with his lead leg forward, and then we retest him on the table. Okay, he picked up 15 degrees more of internal rotation at his hip. We retest his force plate numbers. Okay, over after 2 weeks of doing this, we get an increase in the force production capabilities. We retest his jumps and he got an increase in his reactor strength index. Okay, so we increased internal rotation, we increased maximum force production, we increased connective tissue stiffness. Does that translate to what we want on the field? I don't know. Go throw a baseball and we'll see. And that's essentially the job, right? Now, could we have picked a overcoming action out of a rack pull? Sure. Could we have picked a I don't know, an elevated trap bar deadlift because we wanted the impulse of the force production to be a little bit shorter than an overcoming action? Sure, we could have done that too. Does any of those exercises reduce what we're trying to get from an adaptation standpoint? I don't know. Maybe. Maybe if we put them in a particular position and they get the force production that we want, but we lose IR, is that actually what we wanted to accomplish? I don't know. Go throw. Let's see what it looks like. So that's where like, I think on social media, it's nice and it's easier just because of that platform to kind of simplify things and divide things into black and white. And we're only going to look at one variable and we're only going to say like this is the only thing that matters in terms of this particular individual. When in reality, like if someone's actually on the training floor with me and they're saying that and having that conversation, I'm not going to think very highly of them because they're missing a lot of the bigger picture in terms of what we're actually trying to accomplish for this person. So instead, hopefully we can have a conversation of like, yeah, I totally get what you're saying, but like all these other things matter too. What are your thoughts on that? And if they're still giving me Instagram feedback, it's like, okay, we're missing the bigger picture here, right? But that's kind of like the issue with Instagram in general or any kind of social media platform is that it's short form dialogue. So you got to get to the gist of things really quickly. It's like, okay, try and boil down even just like that hypothetical situation that I said to you into one caption. And some people try and do this, and then you're just like scrolling on Instagram, like reading through this whole thing. Whereas I just went on Instagram to mindlessly scroll through stuff. And like that's really not the point of the platform in general, right? If I want to like sit down and read dialogue and have this kind of dialogue, I'm gonna go somewhere else for that. I'm not necessarily gonna do it on Instagram. But that's kind of the nature of what's happened with our industry in the past, you know, majority of like this last decade and everything, right?
Yeah, yeah,
You know, that it is what it is. It's just the platform that we have, right?
yeah.
So,
So, um, outside of like the ass angle, another question like related to pitching or related to baseball
yep.
is I know like I'm not sure if it started with a coach named Franz Bosch, but like nowadays like there are more and more like coaches or athlete uses like aqua ball for no matter
Hmm,
it's like baseball or like basketball, even basketball, even like I think
sure.
like track. So
Yeah, any
yeah. So um first of all I want to ask like your thoughts on like using those like aqua ball to like correct their mechanics or like yeah, what are your thoughts on like overall those stuff?
sure. Um, so it's funny for again for a number of different reasons, Instagram takes things out of context, right? And it creates like this very reactionary response out of a lot of people, especially towards like something like an aqua ball, where a lot of times, and maybe rightfully so, like you'll see coaches like trying to use them, and it's like, okay, why are we doing this? Is it actually accomplishing what we want, right? So it almost looks like this kind of trendy, esoteric, like overthinking it kind of thing in terms of like, is this really necessary, right? And sometimes I'll agree with you on that, but it depends on the application of it, right? So not anything in the gym for anyone to like feel a certain type of way about any kind of implement is kind of weird. We all do it, but it's weird because we have like this weird emotional response to something like an aqua ball. It's like it's just a plastic thing with water in it. Like, calm down, right? How we potentially use it is really what dictates whether it's a good decision or not, right? So Bosch and that crew will use it for different reasons. And if I understand enough of their stance based on, I've read his I read his running book. He doesn't really go too much into like the aquabag world. Does he talk about perturbations in his running book? I don't think so. I think
I
he
think
mostly
it's
just
the
goes.
another book. Like,
Yeah, I think it's mostly in like his two motor learning books. He
yeah.
goes into like trying to create perturbations to offset the motor strategy to ingrain that motor strategy deeper and deeper, which maybe that's a big fat maybe, right? I don't necessarily know if shaking an aqua ball is really what's going to do it. I think there's many other ways that you could create perturbate. So this is actually a fantastic example. I'll see a lot of like pitching drills where a pitcher will be like standing on their back foot. It's like, okay, we're like trying to ingrain their strategy of like how they're standing on their back foot. So we're going to put them in the position that we want, and then we're going to take this aqua ball and we're going to shake it to create turbulence and instability and things like that for them to be able to stay on their foot. Whereas in my perspective, you're essentially changing the variables within that system to the point where you're essentially changing the strategy that they're demonstrating. So it's not that you're enabling that strategy to be more clear. You're actually adding more noise to the system and more noise to the signal, so it makes it harder and harder for them to actually demonstrate the actual exercise. Meanwhile, there's other ways that you can perturb the system. So let's say we're originally trying to retrain this back leg strategy, and we're putting conscious effort to maintaining a specific position with that back leg. Now, I can perturb that system differently just by forcing them to demonstrate unconscious actions with that back leg, because then that would also demonstrate to me that they have that motor pattern much more ingrained because they don't have to think about it as much when they're doing it. So let's take a pitcher, and now instead of me having him think about his back foot or how his knee's positioned or how his hip is positioned, we have his pitching coach come in and say, "Hey, you've been throwing four seam fastballs, super basic throw. Now I want you to throw a slider off of this." Okay, now that totally perturbed his thought process to where he's got to think about his new grip that he's been working on as opposed to his backside foot. Or you can have a pitching coach come in and say, "All right, we're going to simulate there's a runner on first and third, there's one out, and you've got the number four hitter coming up to the plate, and he's on a hot streak. What are you throwing to him?" Okay, so now that added even further levels of complexity that's going to quote unquote perturb their system, but I'm not adding any biomechanical variables that would muddy the signal in terms of their ability to actually demonstrate that strategy. In my perspective, that would be a much better way to perturb their system, but also see if we're actually ingraining the motor pattern as opposed to just, it'd be like having them try to throw off of like an Eric's pad. Like we've changed too many of the actual concrete variables for that motor plan to be demonstrated, as opposed to perturbing them in other ways to actually get them to demonstrate the motor pattern we want, right? The majority of why I will use something like a water bag is because I care a lot about essentially trying to simulate what the guts or the internal forces are doing inside of your body. And then can I encourage different biomechanical strategies, different force production strategies, different levels of impulse to encourage the guts to move in a specific direction with a specific amount of tempo or momentum or anything like that. And then can I essentially enable their body to better capture and utilize some of that momentum that we're essentially demonstrating and replicating and magnifying with that water bag. So again, like that's where I'll try to utilize them. I don't think water bags are bad. It's just a matter of like how are we trying to implement some of these things in terms of the outcomes that we're trying to get. You could say the same thing for like when people put like bands on kettlebells and like things are shaking all around. Like, okay, that's kind of like the same thing as taking our water bag and shaking it all around. Is it going to create specific adaptations? Yeah, maybe. And maybe those things are what we want. And so then that's a good exercise. But you got to be very clear about the adaptations that you want so that you actually understand what you're doing to that person, as opposed to just doing it because of seeing stuff on Instagram or reading something in a book or, some of the things that people say they're doing aren't actually the things that are occurring to that person just based on physiology alone. Like there are certain things that this is promoting, and then there's certain things that is jargon that people created online that isn't actually physiology. We're just creating up terms right now. So
Nice.
yeah.
Nice, nice. I love it. I love it. So, and I'm actually glad that you brought up like uh gut and what is it? The internal force. So,
Yeah,
can you like kind of give us a, an example like how would you implement like the alcohol and how does that change like the internal force?
sure. So I'm gonna back up a little bit just so in case someone's listening and is like totally, new to some of this stuff, we'll at least cover like why I care about this stuff, right? So inside your body, and it depends on who you are and the person you are. So if you're a tiny little lady, you might only have like 20 pounds of guts. If you're a really big dude, you might have upwards of like 45 pounds of guts. And maybe if you ate Thanksgiving dinner, you're gonna have more stuff floating around in there anyway, right? So there's some variance to it, right? But you essentially have this big bag of stuff stapled to the front of your spine, and it's free floating and it's under the influences of different momentums, right? And the better that we can harness some of this free momentum, or at least control it and channel it into different things that we want, will enable better athletic outcomes, right? So and I think this is a lot more ingrained into how the human body needs to move than we appreciate, right? So if we go back to like this tissue deformation, connective tissue deformation conversation that we were having before. So if you look at studies and you essentially try to overlap when peak force production would be created, peak muscle function would be created, peak tissue deformation would be created, as well as peak intrathoracic and intra-abdominal pressure would be created. Every single one of those overlaps. So here's a simple for instance. You're measuring someone doing like a depth drop jump. So as soon as they drop off of the box and land onto their force plate, that is the peak amount of pressure going into the ground. Excuse me. That is the peak amount of muscle activity would be in the bottom of that position because they're trying to access their stretch shortening cycle. So they're trying to get peak muscle deformation, peak connective tissue deformation. And at the same time, you're also going to get peak amounts of intra-abdominal pressure. So you have the muscle activity that is coinciding with increasing pressure. And you also have the muscle activity that's coinciding with increasing tissue deformation. At the same time, that's the point where, as you're landing in that position, the guts are going to come from an elevated position. They're going to slam down into the pelvic floor. So I need to generate pressure to control them. And I need to create pressure to deform connective tissues to absorb that momentum and that energy that's coming down. So that when I release all that pressure and release all that tension and release that deformation of tissue, I can essentially propel my center of gravity and the guts back up into the air. Okay. So now if we take that moment of maximum pressure and maximum force production and we equate it to something like a baseball pitch, that's when the front foot is going to hit on the mound and we're going to go into max layback. So I get maximum force production, maximum tissue deformation. At that moment, my guts are going to be going forward in space towards that front leg. If I don't create enough force and pressure, those guts are going to continue to go forward. But if I can demonstrate enough force and pressure, I'll be able to shoot and fling everything back, which will then have this ricochet effect to continue the rest of my body forward in that direction. So if I can kind of channel that momentum and make it move in the direction that I want it to move, that would be very beneficial for some of the athletic performances that I'm trying to enable, right? And that's essentially what I'm trying to do with a water bag. So if we've done everything to increase like the tissue stiffness on that front leg, okay, I'll do some sort of water bag drill where I'm having them hurl the water in the bag down and forward towards that front foot. But as soon as they land on that front foot, I want to see all the water in that bag shoot back towards their back hip. They're getting a feel for all of that momentum coming forward, and it's magnified just because we're adding external load and weight to replicate that, right? So it's magnified so they get essentially a leading resistance or feeling like, oh, someone's pushing me in this direction. I need to push back in the opposite direction, but at a magnified effect to make that strategy a lot more apparent to them in their mind. And then it also gives them a feel for the direction that they need to try and go in. And then that gives me feedback as well of I can watch them and be like, oh, okay, the water actually moved in this direction or out here instead of here. So now I can kind of refine things from a biomechanics standpoint of, well, it moved in this direction because they didn't have any access to space in their hip in that direction. So now we're going to do this exercise instead to give them that access. And then does that change how the water is essentially moving in this exercise? If it does, great. We did what we wanted. So yeah, in a nutshell, in a very big nutshell, how I think about some of that stuff and do some of that stuff. So there you go.
Nice, nice. That's awesome. That's all. I like it.
Yeah.
So, uh, I'm only gonna take an hour of your time. So, uh, before we finish it, uh, I know you, besides like the Instagram post, you also have a website that you post a lot of like great content.
Hmm.
And so,
Yeah,
yep.
so myself and Mike K, we both post on the site Substack, but you can essentially like create your own blog website situation on there. So it's called context driven Substack. And again, kind of alluding to the conversation we were having before about social media just being a poor medium for talking about some of this stuff. We're essentially putting a lot of those conversations on there because it's just a better platform to be able to talk and converse and put these thoughts out there. So we're not confined to, a minute long reel and X amount of characters on my caption. You can, I mean, hell, we've got 45-minute, hour-long presentations on there essentially. But and so if you guys want to check that out, the link for that is in my Instagram bio. Um, and yeah, we'll send it over. So yeah, it's good. We've been doing it for almost 2 years now at this point and gotten really good feedback from people and I've enjoyed it. Mike's enjoyed it. So it's been beneficial to say the least. So yeah,
Yeah, it is really good. It is really good.
thank you. Appreciate it.
Nice, nice.